Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to either join this live or watch it as a recording. So, hello to everyone watching it as a recording. Um, so, just before we kick off, just a reminder if you are watching it live, there is a chat where you can put in questions and answers, and we'll go through stuff like that. Or there is also a Q&A function where you can put questions in. I'll see them and I can come back to them throughout the session. There are points of interactivity throughout this session. So if you're watching live and you want to interact by asking questions or getting involved, please get ready to do so. Or if you're watching this recording, there might be points where you want to pause it and kind of take some time to reflect and think about what you're doing before we really get into it. So this is our second webinar of this series. And today we are focusing on questioning strategies for tutors. My name is Arthur Moore. Really briefly, for anyone who's watching this doesn't know who I am. So I am an online maths tutor and I have been for around 4.5 years now. That is my full-time job. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher and I've taught in schools across the UK and internationally. I run a CPD outfit for tutors, looking to develop tutors in their pedagogy and their teaching practices, and that's called Navigator Tutor. And I tutor under the name of More Edu. In 2024, I was lucky enough to win Tutor of the Year by the Tutors Association, and my outfit, Navigator Tutor, has also been shortlisted for multiple awards on multiple occasions and was listed for Educational Resource for Tutors in the 2025 National Tutoring Awards. So there's the really quick thing about me. And we are focusing today all around questioning. So our aims for today's session, I aim to give you an overall 4-step questioning strategy and some specific techniques to help you develop your questioning. Now, I'm really passionate about questioning as part of our teaching or tutor toolkit. I think it is arguably the most powerful, important tool we have at our disposal to help our students. It'd be great if you could just take a moment for those who are live, just in the chat, to just let me know what you tutor, what age group. I believe it's all one-to-one, but if anyone does anything else, please let me know. But if you can just take a moment just to say what you tutor, gives me a really good idea of how to focus this. I'm a secondary maths tutor, as I mentioned, by trade. So what we're going to talk about today, the first thing we're going to talk about are these 4 steps for questioning strategy, and then we're going to go into some more specific techniques. But before we do either of those, I want to just take a moment to think about what we actually mean by a questioning strategy. Now, what's really interesting here is a strategy is a plan designed to achieve a long-term aim. Now, this is really important. So when we're talking about questioning strategies, what we're not talking about completely is the pure question themselves. That's not just what we're talking about. So I'm not here. I can see some of you to say that you are language teachers on the live webinars. I'm not here to tell you what makes a great question for your language subjects, for the people you work with. I'm not here to say this is how you should construct a English or economics question. What I'm going to focus on today is this overall questioning strategy that is applicable to any age group, to any subject, to any student that we are working with. And hopefully what you find is when we take a step back and think about our questioning strategies that we can implement, our questions are even more impactful. There's nothing worse than asking a really, really good question and then it not having the effect that we wanted to, because maybe we didn't put the strategy around that question. So when I talk about a strategy, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the plan that we are implementing here. And sometimes it's important to take a step back and think about our plan rather than just doing something. So I'm going to talk about the 4 steps that I use within my questioning process. So the 4 steps I use, I call framing, asking, thinking, and the answers. So when I'm thinking about my questioning technique, I break it down into these 4 areas. And I'm going to talk about them individually now, and then we'll talk about how they come together. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the framing. Now, I think framing is actually my favorite part of the whole 4 steps. Framing is really interesting. What I mean by framing is the bit that we are doing before the question has been asked. So this is the bit I'm talking to my student with before I actually ask them a question. Now, the example I'm going to use here is if I just throw a question out there, if I just put my question out there, how many questions do you ask in a lesson? How many questions do you ask in a lesson? Now, some of you, especially if you're watching this as a recording, might say, I'm not even going to think about this question. I'm not going to engage with this question. Or maybe the dog just ran in the background. Or maybe someone just called out your name. Or maybe your phone just buzzed and you missed a question. And you hear me say something, and you don't really kind of comprehend it. And you just kind of, I do some questions. We're not really interacting there. Whereas what I really want to think about is the framing, is the stuff I do before the question. Here's an example of a frame. In a moment, I'm going to ask you a question about your tutoring. Now, hopefully what's happened there is you've all got ready to answer this question because I've put it out there that I'm going to ask a question. I'm kind of giving you a little nudge that I'm about to ask you a question. So I'm framing it. I'm saying, before we even focus in on the picture, here's the thing that is about to happen. What's really good with your students here when we do this is it signpost to our student that they need to listen, So in a moment, I'm going to be asking everyone a question. Bang, I've got everyone's focus. Everyone's engaged in the question. My student is ready. If I say to my student, I'm going to put up a slide in a moment, I'm going to ask you some questions about it. Straight away, I'm signposting to my student that this is important. This is something to focus on. So what I've done is I'm just giving them essentially a little nudge that a question is coming. And it's a really easy thing to implement to your tutoring. It's really easy. You just, before you have a question coming, you give a hint, a nudge to the student that the question is about to come. What that does is it basically helps them focus in on what is about to happen. We spoke last webinar about how we can help our students focus in on bits of information when we're talking about their working memory. Well, this is what a framing does. It's saying, ignore all this other stuff. This is what I'm going to be asking you a question of. So that is the pre-question. And you notice I haven't said anything mathematical there at all. I'm just talking about how we are going to do the next step. And that's when we come on to the asking stage. So I can now think about actually asking my question. Now, again, I'm not going to talk to you specifically about saying, right, let's talk about what makes a history question. What we're going to be talking about is how we can actually structure my question. So what I like to do when I'm asking a question is I've put the frame on, the question is about to happen, and now I say something like to my student, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about what the author is intending from the paragraph we're about to look at. So I'm pre-asking the question. What that does is it lets my student know that they need to be thinking about the author in this aspect of this question. It's already given them that bit of information. If you were teaching a new language, you may say, in a moment, I'm going to ask you a question. There's my frame. Now really be focusing on how you're going to pronounce some of these words. So before I even ask my question, I'm focusing the student in on what I want them thinking about. For maths, I would be saying, now I'm going to be asking you a question in a moment to look at the diagram. Remember, this question is about angles, so let's focus in on that. I'm putting as much information into the question. And what I'm doing is I'm front loading the question. I'm putting the information that the student needs to know at the start of the question before I ask the question. If I ask them my question, if we talk about something from history, if I say, when was the Battle of Hastings? That's what my son's studying at the moment, so that's what my thoughts are all about. Where did the Battle of Hastings take place? That's all your mind is going to be focusing on. That's all the students' work in memory. Whereas if I want to get better answers out of them, I need to front load that question. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you a question about the Battle of Hastings. Remember, we did some work on the context of how Howard Godwinson got to Hastings. And now I actually ask my question. And what I'm doing there is I'm just giving the student, I'm front loading the question so they get all the information. So now they can actually focus in on the question. And this is really important because we want our student to be focusing on a specific thing when we ask them questions. So I've asked my great question. We're going to talk about some different types of question answering in a bit. And now I move on to the thinking stage. Now, the thinking stage is a really simple idea. On average, teachers tend to give between 1 and 2 seconds before they get an answer to a question. Doesn't matter whether they're working in classes, in groups, or one-to-one. And the problem is here, think about what your students got to do in those 2 seconds. They've got to understand the question. They've got to process all the terminology, the language you've used in the question. They've got to go to their long-term memory and remember the information that they need to answer the question. They've got to construct an answer. They've kind of got to say the answer in their head, and they've got to get ready to actually articulate it to you. That's too much for them to do. It's too much for them to do in that space of time. And the reason we don't give our students long enough to think about their questions is we are the experts in this dynamic. I'm the expert, I'm the teacher, my student is what we would call the novice. And it's very hard for me as the expert to remember what it's like to be a novice. If you think about any skill you have, it's very hard to imagine what it's like before you have that skill. Throwing a ball. Can you imagine what it was like before you knew how to throw a ball? It's really tricky. Once you know how to ride a bike, it's very hard to unlearn that. It's very hard to not be able to ride the bike. And what that means is we forget how long our student needs to actually process information. If I'm asking my question about circle theorems to the maths teachers who are watching, well, when I ask a question about circle theorems, I instantly know which theory I want them talking about. But my student needs to go through all the circle theorems. If you're thinking about MFL, a lot of you will be thinking in the language that you are teaching. Your student is not probably at that stage yet. They've got to do all these extra steps. In history, you've got this wealth of knowledge that you can pull different contexts from. The student hasn't got as many bodies of knowledge. So it's much harder for them to remember the key bits of information. So essentially, we want to give more thinking time. And if we can give more thinking time, you will get better answers from your students. Now, this is not me saying you should always give long gaps between questions. If I just said, have you taught a lesson today? I don't need to now wait 20 seconds to get that answer. But if I ask, how did your lesson go today? I need to give you a longer frame to consider that. If I ask you, how did your lesson go today and what would you do differently next time? I need to give you even longer because I want a more elaborate answer to it. And then the other thing is answers. Oh, apologies, answers. I'll come back to those quotes in a moment. I'll come to the quotes called answers. Now, what answers are, I'm not talking about just getting the answer from the question. What I do with my students is when I ask them for the answer, so I'm saying, Ayushi, what's the answer here? I can, again, put a little bit of information in there. So I could say, Ayushi, what did you get as the answer? Remember to use some of that key terminology we've been focusing on. Or Ayushi, I'm going to ask you what the author intended here. Remember what we spoke about earlier with use of language. And what I'm doing is I'm just, again, giving that little nudge to my student, to their working memory, that this is how I want you to be answering. And if you combine that with framing, if you combine that with asking and with giving more thinking time, you get even better answers because we're giving our students the guidance on how we want them to answer it. There's a couple of quotes I want to show you here for the overall thing. I really like this quote from Peps McCree. Expert-induced blindness is what I was talking about there, where we as the expert forget what our student what it's like to be the student. And consequently, we have an aversion to silence as tutors, especially as tutors. I'm sure you've all found this. I want to take a moment to reflect upon this. You're tutoring a session online, and maybe there's a parent in the background, and we're very conscious of we are trying to deliver content in our time zone. And we get really kind of, I need to fill the lesson. I need to fill the lesson with talk and content. I need to be talking because that shows the benefits that I'm given as a tutor. But because of this, we rushed our students' thinking time because no one wants to have a silent tutoring lesson. I'm just going to give you a moment to just personally reflect upon your last lesson, your last tutoring, whenever that was. Was there a point where you tried to fill that silence? I know I do this all the time, especially when I look back on my lessons. And the other one is a quote here from Craig Barton, the educator, CPD provider, and maths teacher. So when we give our students more thinking time, which is what we've discussed, we get better answers in terms of accuracy, in terms of their length, which often means that is linked to their complexity. And all these things are because essentially we're giving the brain more time to process that information. And that's what those 4 steps are all about there. Those 4 steps are all about there. And the effect this will have on your tutoring is you will get better answers. And better answers allows you to do a whole host of things, some of which we are going to talk about in the next bit of time. When you get very, very simple answers from your students, it's very hard to kind of keep delving digger, something we call elaborative interrogation or ask probing questions. It's very hard when we get very simple responses to our questions. So I just want you to take a moment to reflect there upon the overall strategy for questioning. And I just want you thinking about the 4 stages that I've discussed. We've discussed framing. Oh, I've just managed to spell that wrong. We've discussed framing. We've discussed asking. We've discussed thinking time. And we've discussed the answers. And I just want you to take a moment to reflect upon your work here and think about which of those 4 stages you think you need to develop as a tutor. And if you're happy to put something in the chat, that would be fantastic. If you just want to do a little bit of self-reflection, that's utterly fine. But I just want you to think about those 4 stages of the question: the frame, the pre-question, the actual asking of the question, the thinking time involved, and the answers. And just want you to have a little think about where could you develop as a tutor? Where could you develop? I know what I'm always thinking of. I'll give my reflections in a moment. This is a really good question here from Genevieve talking about how much nudging is beneficial. So basically what we're trying to do with that pre-question, which are what I think you're talking about, Genevieve, in kind of the framing stage, is what we're trying to do is we are trying to bring our students' attention to what we want them focusing on. So when you say how much nudging, I would say the nudging is needed for them to be focusing on what you want them to be focused on. There's no point in you asking your brilliant, brilliant question to a student who is not engaging by listening. And I don't mean that they are disengaged, they're looking elsewhere, they're on their phone. I mean kind of cognitively engaged. You want them really thinking and listening about your question. So I would be nudging until I'm confident that my students' attention is what I want them to be focusing on. So, for example, if I've put an image up that I want the student to be thinking about, and they're going to explain to me what's going on in the picture, and that works for a lot of our subject areas here. If they're not looking at the picture and focusing on it and really thinking about it in that sense, there's no point me asking questions about the author's intent or thinking about how they can use better language if it's an MFL lesson. So that was why I would answer to kind of nudging. If I reflect upon my own tutoring and teaching here, the thing that really has made a massive benefit to me is that idea of extending thinking time. By just giving my students a little bit more thinking time, I see much, much better answers. And that is completely irrelevant of their age or what level we're studying up or what topic. If I give them more time, I get better answers. So I want to talk about some specific techniques that we can actually use with our questioning. So what we've talked about there is kind of a strategy, an idea to structure our questioning. We're going to talk about some specific techniques now. So number one is pose, pause, pounce, bounce. And I just want in the chat, if you could just do you've heard of this or you've not heard of this. Is this a phrase or is this a phrase you've never heard of? So is this a phrase you've heard of? Sandra, and it's a really good point there about kind of the visual clues to young students. You can like literally even leaving on the board. Remember to use keywords. Like even that as a visual clue, it reminds the student what we want to be thinking of. You're absolutely right there. So pose, pause, pounce, bounce. Now, this is a brilliant way of structuring your question, and it kind of links into what I was talking about there. So the idea of pose, pause, pounce, bounce is we pose our question. We put our question out there. The question is now has been set. And this works one-to-one when you're working kind of with the platform you're doing, i.e. Tutorful here. Or maybe if you're doing group tuition or face-to-face, or you're working in another scenario where you're not even doing tutoring, you're just asking questions. So I put the question out there. I pose the question. I then pause, elaborating and putting focus on that thinking time. But I make a real conscious decision to pause. I don't fill it with information. So something I'm often guilty with, and hopefully I'm trying not to do that here. I will say something like, I'm going to give you time to reflect upon that. And then I'm going to keep talking while you're reflecting. And that makes it really difficult for you. So I pose a question and then I stop and I pause. What I then do is I then will use the word pounce. We go to the student for that answer. So you've had the thinking time. That's when I want the response. And then what I do is I bounce this question. So when we get answers from our students, that is a brilliant place for us to start a discussion or use more elaborative questioning styles or use probing questions, which I'll talk about. And this idea of pose, pause, pounce, bounce is a really nice way for you to structure your questions just mentally. Right, I've put the question out there. I need to pause. What's the answer? Right, and now I'm going to bounce this. And let's just focus in on that idea of a bounce question. What I mean by a bounce question is the student has given me something, and then I use that to ask a further question. Not a different question. I jump on the answer that they specifically have given me. So a student gives me an answer, and I might ask something like, now, why do you think that? Really simple question. Why did you do that? How does the author make you feel that? Could you give me that answer again, but focus on which terminology you use? How could you say that answer to me again, but give it even better? A bounce question that I really like is, what would someone who disagree with you say? I know we've got some history and economics teachers. That's a lovely question to ask. What would someone who disagrees with you say? And that really forces the student to think. If you're doing other subject areas, you can still take that idea and change it. So what do you think someone else would say about your answer? And very often you'll find the student won't just say they would say it was a brilliant answer. They say, well, they think I could do this. And what we're doing there is we're getting the student to reflect upon their own questioning. So bounce questions are fantastic. And what you'll find there is the bounce questions become more natural, and you naturally go into a discussion and use your questioning as a strategy to induce discussion with your students. Especially if you're working with students who are maybe struggling to kind of engage with discussion, or they're really shy, or maybe they're not really feeling like tutoring today, so it's struggling to get stuff out of them. A well-structured bounce question. And for those of you who've been tutoring a while, really kind of want to keep pushing your tutoring, what a bounce question, you can start planning your bounce questions. So I'm sure plenty of you think about your questionings beforehand, but you can start thinking about your bounce question. What is the student going to say to me, and what can I come back to them with? And what bounce questions do is they bring discussion as a normal aspect of your tutoring, which has loads and loads of benefits. Now, we want that kind of discussion taking place. But what's also great, I'm sure most of you see your students about once a week. Once you've been doing this for a while, your student starts to expect those bounce questions. So if you're constantly asking your student, could you say that better with more terminology? They start to consider the bounce question as part of their autonomous thinking process. They start doing it automatically. So they start iterating their own answers before you've even answered your bounce question. So if my student knows I'm always going to say, please bring in more terminology into your answer, they will start doing that because they will start asking themselves that question. And I really think PB, pose, pause, bounce, is a fantastic developer of your questioning strategy, especially with a focus on those bounce questions. It's really, really a great way to develop your tutoring. And you will see it when you start answering bounce questions and start doing more and more, then you start naturally considering what the student is doing. So, for example, we go back to one. If I'm always saying to my student, could you ask it with better terminology, or how could you elaborate on your answer more? I might start bringing that into the framing, the asking stage. Remember, before I ask the question, that we want to be using better terminology. I start to pre-establish what the bounce question is going to be and put that into the student's thinking process. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them in chat. There's a couple in there, so I'm just going to answer those right now. Just give me a moment to read them. So Sandrine has asked a really nice question of a student's given an answer. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, Sandrine. The student's given an answer. And you would say, how would you change your answer if you wanted to answer more formally? Brilliant bounce question. Really good bounce question. Because what you're doing there is you're getting the student to reflect upon their own answer. So in a maths example, we could say, right, it's a really good answer. What would an examiner say about your answer? What would an examiner say about your answer? In history, you could say, do you have any more evidence that would back up your answer? I'm not sure I agree with you here. Is there anything you can say to convince me further? So what a bounce question is doing is just building on their question. What's different to just asking another question is it is a process built on what the student is giving me. I'm not just saying, here's question one, they give me an answer, right, here's a different question two. It's the questions that are building on each other. And that is the bounce aspect of this. So Sandrine, I think that's a really nice example in your subject area, which I assume is, MFL, so a French teacher. What could you say to say this more formally? Really nice. Someone is saying, again, just a question someone sent me, someone saying about thinking time, like how do we know the optimal thinking time? Essentially, we don't. Essentially, we don't know what the optimal thinking time is, and it will be different for different questions. As I said, if I ask you for what your address is and then gave you a minute to think about it, that's far too long. That's not working. But if I'm asking you a complex question about a moment in history and what led to those events, well, I need to be giving you time to actually consider all those things. And it can be awkward as a tutor, especially online, to just kind of sit there in silence. Like, it's awkward if I ask you a question, just do this. Gets a bit awkward, like we can feel that. But that's because we have an aversion to silence as educators because of that expert novice dynamic that I spoke about. Okay, if you've got any more questions, keep putting them in the chat or the Q&A section. So next going to talk about hinge questions. Okay, so hinge questions are much kind of like the name says. They are a point in the lesson where we are trying to decide whether the student is ready to go to the next stage. I open the door and go through to the next area. So, for example, I'm considering, are we ready to move on? Am I confident that the student is at a stage where we have the information we need to move on? And that's where this hinge question comes in. So it's a question deliberately designed to consider whether the student is ready to move on to the next stage. So, for example, if this was in our history or geography lesson, and we're looking to go into more detail about a certain area, but we can't go into detail until we're confident the student knows the facts, the key information, then my hinge question could be, can you just tell me the key facts about this area, about your specific area? I'm not going to pretend to be a history teacher here. In maths, it might be before, if I'm expanding brackets, I give them a specifically designed question to make me confident that they're not falling for any of the misconceptions. I may bring in negative numbers or something like that. If it's MFL and I'm looking to move towards speaking or maybe writing something down, well, my question would be, I'm going to ask them something where they can give me a verbal answer, which confirms to me that we're now ready to move on. So it's that question that is specifically designed to consider whether we can move on or not. And what happens to this in your tutoring is we move too fast. We're so conscious of getting enough content into our sessions that we go, right, I've got to get through all this content. I'm sure if you take a moment to reflect, that's happened at some point in your tutoring. And what happens here is we're just building on sandy foundations. So yes, we might get all the content out there and we tick off everything off our to-do list, or we get through all our slides, but our student hasn't got any of the benefits from it because they were not ready to move on in the first place. And that's absolutely crucial. So a good hinge question is a point where you are confident that you are ready to move on. And they are really nice things to pre-plan. So I pre-plan my hinge questions, and I will quite often have them on my slides or on my whiteboard or on the online platform that I'm using. However I'm tutoring in that moment, or however I'm working with a student, may have it written down in front of me. I've got that question ready because I've said to myself as the teacher, I need my student to be able to do this before we move on. They're really nice things to plan beforehand. I just want to take a moment for everyone to reflect here. I just want to ask everyone, and if you're happy to put them in the chat, please do. Or if you're watching this as a recording, write it down. Or if you just want to write it down and not share it, that's absolutely fine. I want you to consider how much time you spend planning your questions in respect to how much time you spend planning the content. So just want you having a think about how much time you have spent planning your questions, or do you rely on it kind of instinctually? So I'm just going to give you 90 seconds or so to reflect upon that. If anyone wants to put their thoughts in the chat, that'd be absolutely fantastic. Okay, so there's a couple of questions coming into the Q&A section. and a couple that people have sent me thing. Feel free to, you can send the message to me directly, put them in the Q&A, or you can just put them into the group chat if you're happy to do that. Okay, so someone has asked about hinge questions. How do I plan my hinge questions? So one way you can do this that I think is really effective is to work backwards. So what you do is you look at halfway through your lesson when you have that point where you move on, you look at the next task. This is the task we are doing. And I would say to myself, if I was starting my lesson with this task, what would I need the student to know? So what would I need the student to know? And then I would ask myself, how can I get my student to prove to me that they know this? So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. There's some really effective questioning strategies you can bring into this that are really easy. True or false questions. Absolutely brilliant questions. Absolutely brilliant questions. True or false, yes or no, however you want to call them. If you consider your subject in history, well, before we move on, I need them to know these key bits of information. I'm going to do some true or false, agree or disagree. With maths, I might put up a question and say, can you spot the mistake? Because if I put the mistakes up that I'm anticipating my students might struggle with, and they can spot those mistakes, then that's showing to me that they're probably ready to move on with the lesson. If you're doing something in MFL and you need them to be able to use these key bits of language or grammatical techniques before you move on, then test them to see how they actually do that on that. Do or true or false, a yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down, however you want to do it. But look ahead in your lesson and go, what do I need the student to do in order to be able to do that? And then how can I test them on that? So that's a really nice way to kind of plan your hinge questions. Someone else is saying, how do I know in the lesson when it's a hinge point? Like, really nice question. So your lesson will naturally be broken down into different areas, sometimes very deliberately. You will have like section 1, section 2, section 3, but sometimes there's those informal steps where we are building on. So I would say whenever you are moving higher up in terms of their understanding or to the next stage of working that requires something else to be known, do a hinge question. You don't have to call it a hinge question. You don't have to have a hinge question. Just put a question on the board and get the student to confirm to them. Now, sometimes, and this is linked to another question saying, how do we get our students to engage with the questioning? I really like using the phrase, prove it to me. Okay, so just before we move on, I just want you to prove to me that you can do this. It's a really nice way of getting my students to go, yeah, do you know what? I am going to show that I can do this. And then when they get it right, it's a brilliant moment. They get that moment of, yeah, do you know what? I've proven to the teacher that we're good to go. But also, if they get it wrong, there's no kind of disagreement there because they haven't been able to prove to you. So I find that's a really nice way of kind of when I put my hinge questions in saying, well, this is the moment. I just need you to prove something to me. Just need to prove something to me. And this kind of brings me on. And someone else has asked a question of just like, how do I make sure my hinge questions aren't kind of like, I have a hinge question moment, which I've kind of mentioned. What we're talking about with all these things, these strategies and kind of techniques that we use, what these do, the more we use them, the more they just become a natural part of our tutoring. I'm not sitting here saying you don't ask brilliant questions at all. I do not think that is the case at all. But when we are conscious about the techniques we are using, we do stuff even better. If you think about when you are, for example, cooking a dish, cooking a meal that you've cooked loads of times, if you kind of do it on autopilot, you know kind of what you're going to get, and you will do it very well. If it's a dish you cook all the time, you do it very well. But if you completely focus on it, then you will do it even better. And it might only be a little bit better. But if it's a little bit better each time, you will get better at it. Another example is kind of like catching a ball, playing catch with someone. I'm sure we can all catch a ball if thrown at us. But if I'm trying to do that and I'm kind of giving my focus, I might drop 1 in 100. But if I give it my complete and utter focus, I might get rid of that 1 out of 100. And this is what we're doing. We're essentially just turbocharging our questioning strategies. So what you keep thinking about, some of these questions are really good coming in. They really get me thinking. So thank you. So when we're talking about questioning, the main thing I really want everyone to take away from this is to think beyond your questions to consider your questioning strategy. So sometimes as educators, we put a lot of emphasis on the actual question we are asking our students. Whereas if we take a step back to think about the strategy that we are going to do, then our questions not only become better, but they become more effective and efficient. We spoke about this in our webinar, the previous webinar. We spoke about trying to get the brain to work in an effective and efficient way. And a good question does both of those things. It gets answers from our students more effectively, and their cognitive process, their mental processes in the background are more efficient. And I don't mean in terms of time, although that will be a natural benefit to this. I mean they will refine and give you better, clearer, concise answers, which is what we want. We don't want our students giving loads of loaf of waffle. We want them answering the question. Does anyone have any questions there about anything I've said in the previous moment? Any questions at all? Just going to give everyone 30 seconds to just think about it. If you've got any questions, just put them in the chat there. May take a moment just to note something down. Okay, someone's put a really good question to me, sent on the Q&A section. A really nice question about being the expert. It's a really, really nice question. So what this question is saying is, how do I, as the expert, remember what it's like to be the novice? How as I, as the tutor, know what it's like to be the student? And I'm going to go into this in even more detail in another webinar. But when we come to questioning, what I would ask yourself is, what do I know about this topic? And what do I take for granted that I know about this topic? So if we're talking about anything to do with, for example, Henry VIII, there is stuff that I just automatically know, and I don't have to question myself about it. But that is the specific stuff that I need to make sure my student has as the knowledge before we can keep going. So that would be my questioning strategy. I'd be asking myself, what do I take for granted here? And how can I ask that? So in maths, a classic example is when it says find out angle AED. I know what that angle is. I don't have to think about it. I might say to my student, just before I ask you this question, can you just put a dot where that angle AED is? Okay, they've got it. We're ready to go. Oh, wait, do you know what? They actually don't know the angle we're trying to find. How on earth are they going to answer the question if they don't know what angle they're trying to find? So it's a nice reflective question to ask yourself. What do I assume they know? What do I assume they know? It's a really good question when you're thinking about planning your questions. So my final top tip before I open up kind of the floor for any kind of reflective questions or talk about question strategies in general. My final top tip for questions is very much give more thinking time. If you take anything away from this webinar here, is to try and give your students more thinking time to process the awesome questions that you are asking, especially if we are building more elaborate, detailed questions that we've been talking about. There's no point me asking a really well-designed hinge question and then giving my student absolutely no time to consider it or think about it. So if you take one thing away, I really want you to think about how you can give your students more thinking time to do with this. Now, in a moment, I'm going to come back and answer any more questions. Thank you for everyone who keeps sending questions. Some brilliant questions coming in. Just put the questions in the chat or put them in the Q&A section. I will come to them. Very briefly, I've got a couple of freebies for everyone who is on this seminar. So I run a WhatsApp group where once a week I share a video about pedagogy along with my colleague, Andrea Gatsby. It's a WhatsApp group that isn't about chat. The chat function is disabled, so we are purely just kind of sharing information with you. There's no ads or chat in it, so it's just one notification, and you can join that very easy on WhatsApp. I'll put this up in a moment, but it's a really nice one. There should be one coming out in the next couple of days, but that is literally a once a week video. I run a podcast called Tutoring Tips, where there are 49 tips from tutors from around the world. Who have shared their top tip in tutoring. Those podcasts are literally 2.5 minutes long. You can go, I say hello, the tutor shares their tip, and then that is the podcast done. It's a really nice way. Oh, I should have mentioned the WhatsApp group has about 350 tutors on there from around the world. So it's a really, really popular site. Tutoring tips, I've already mentioned. If you want to learn even more about pedagogy, I have a platform called Navigator Tutor. That is a paid platform. You can go and sign the QR code, find out more about that. Or you can go onto LinkedIn, which is the top right QR code. And I post loads of stuff on there. I have a newsletter about pedagogical tips for tutors. I post videos and information about little tips we can do to turbocharge our tutoring. And we've also got the QR codes there to the free podcast and the WhatsApp group. So I'll briefly leave that on thing, but I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question about anything of this, or put in a wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, that is all fine. Someone's just asked, are these being recorded? Yes, they're all being recorded, and Tutorful will be sharing them with you and the tutors. Hopefully, if you're watching this as a recording, you're watching this recording because it's been shared. So, yes, Genevieve, they will be. How will they be accessed? Tutorful will be in contact with sharing those. So they'll be in contact to share those. But these have all been designed with Tutorful and kind of the Tutorful tutors in mind. Not a problem at all. Does anyone have any specific questions about questioning in their subject or in their academic area? I'm more than happy to answer any questions on that if you want to go into real detail. If you want to leave, that is absolutely fine. And the people who just want to ask questions is absolutely welcome. But the real thing I would like to talk about is like that idea of thinking time. If that's the only thing that you take away, then that's a really, really fascinating idea. I think that's a really, really important idea for us to kind of take into context. And then the other one I would think about is this idea of pose, pause, pounce, bounce. And especially that focus on bounce questions. When we focus on bounce questions, this is difficult. It's a really hard thing to really bring into your tutoring, but the impact is absolutely massive. It's really really good. Someone's asking me, really good question. How do I plan my bounce questions? So this is when your experience as a tutor makes a huge difference, or as an educator, makes a really big difference. So you ask a question and you can probably anticipate the answers you're going to get. You can probably anticipate that given your experience and your subject expertise. So what you can start thinking is, if the student is saying that to me, how can I push their knowledge? And then we spoke about this earlier, that I can start moving the bounce questions when I'm really experienced before the question. I can start indicating to the student that I want more elaborative answers, or I want them to give more evidence, or I want them to use math terminology or notation, for example. Or in English, I want them to use better, more appropriate language. Or in drama, I want them to think about how they're actually performing this. And when I start planning my bounce questions, as we've considered there, you'll change how you teach in a really positive way, because you'll start anticipating the mistakes the students are going to make. And that's really important. Like, What we don't want to be doing is just waiting for the students to make a mistake and then answering a bounce question. We don't really want to go down that route. Bounce questions have made for me to like really push. And if you want to keep it simple for your session tomorrow or later this week, why do you think that? What would someone who disagree with you say? Can you say that again with some more better terminology? They're really easy bounce questions. But what they get the student to do is reflect upon the answer they've given. And that's when you get that discussion going. So I think bounce questions are an absolutely brilliant way to really push your tutoring, and they will really challenge your students. And over time, when they become part of your routine and your strategy that you are doing all the time, you'll just start doing it automatically. So plan them now, and then you'll just find it becomes a natural part. I still plan my bounce questions. I still plan them. I still go, right, what do I anticipate my students saying here? And how can I ask them to reprobe and ask them better questions? So thank you for everyone for, so let me. Thank you to everyone for joining that webinar about questioning. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stick around and ask me. But I've really enjoyed speaking to you all today, or if it's a recording, thank you for taking time to watch it. We've got more webinars coming up across the summer about a range of techniques to make even bigger impact with your tutoring. Thank you for all the lovely comments. Have a lovely evening. I'll stick around on the thing if anyone wants to ask a question off recording.